Welcome back to Social Studies. Some students struggle a little bit more than others on analyzing sources. Today, this is our source. It is our first source in Social 10-1, and I'm going to look at some of the steps that students can use to unpack the source. Please keep in mind that there is no formula per se, but what we're doing here is giving you some suggestions as to steps that you can use. Many of these steps can be combined, and the goal is in the end to tell us what the source believes about the theme of the course. So in grade 10, the core to analyzing the source is to establish, to identify, to explore the perspective of the source, connecting it to globalization. In grade 11, it'd be to identify and explore the source and connecting the source to nationalism. And in grade 12, it'd be to identify the perspective of the source and connect that perspective to ideologies, including liberalism. Now, with the source, I'd always suggest reading it through once to get the big picture. Isolationism limits our potential. Nations and the people within them can only flourish if they connect with others. And then maybe go back and unpack the key terms. Key terms here are isolationism. Key terms here would be nations, flourish, potential, and this idea of connecting with others. There is no explicit mentioning of globalization in the source, but the idea of connecting with others is describing the globalization process. So therefore, we can see that globalization is mentioned here, and we can look at, why is it mentioned? So we begin to look at the source, and we can say, is there a perspective about globalization? So we begin to unpack the source phrase by phrase, looking at the language. So the source begins, isolationism limits our potential. So at first glance, the source is very explicitly an anti-isolationism source by connecting isolationism with limiting our potential. So the source begins as it discredits isolation. It says isolationism limits our potential. So my analysis may begin with that the source begins with a purposeful discrediting of isolationism. It says it limits our potential. But what the source doesn't do is fully develop what does potential look like. What dimension of globalization are we looking at when we mention potential? Are we talking about economic potential, social, political, or cultural potential? So I may begin my analysis paragraph with an identification of the anti-isolationist perspective found in the first sentence and how isolationism is used to suggest that if you practice that, you'll limit your potential. So there's a warning there. Isolationism limits our potential. So the warning is meant to discredit isolationism. But there's this intentional vagueness surrounding what happens if you isolate. It's that your potential will be limited, but what do we mean by potential? So we might unpack that as well. Nations and the people within them can only flourish if they connect with others. So the word flourish is offered as the end goal. This is the carrot, this is what we're trying to achieve, and connecting with others is the means to achieve it. So therefore, if we're looking for a perspective of globalization, we can conclude that globalization, connecting with others, is the vehicle offered to achieve the goal of flourishing. And the opposite of globalization, isolationism, is discredited by attaching that practice with limiting our potential. So in order to get to an S, which is you generally get the source, you would identify this source as an anti-isolationist, pro-globalization perspective that promises flourishing as a consequence of connecting and attacks isolationism as it links that with limiting our potential. If you, in your analysis, generally identify and explore that, you're at an S. You're not incorrect, you're not incomplete, but you could be more sound, more specific, more capable, more adept, and maybe even insightful and comprehensive. So how do we go beyond the S? One way to go beyond the S is to begin to look at the source and see if one can unpack the claims of the source, the assumptions of the source, and do it in a way that allows you to talk about the proponents and opponents of the source. So, for example, the source claims that isolationism limits our potential. Proponents of the source may look at North Korea and look at North Korea economically, and by looking at its per capita GDP or even its gross GDP, we can see that an isolationist country like North Korea is quite limited economically in comparison to a more globalized country like South Korea. So in that way, what we've done is we've taken what's on the page, we've taken the source, and we've added a layer of internalization. We've shown that we're a little more adept, a little more capable at unpacking it by looking at the logic behind the source. In this case, we looked at the claim, isolationism limits our potential, and we attempted to find evidence of that. To further the perspective of the source that isolationism limits our potential, proponents of the source could quantify this claim by looking at North Korea's limited economy because of its limited trading partners. That North Korea has limited itself economically. And then you could do that for the other claim of the source. The second claim of the source is that nations flourish when they connect with others. You could, and there's a logical contrast there by talking about South Korea, but you could also look at countries like China and how that once China in the 1970s joined the global marketplace, they saw a very steady, rapid growth of their of their economy within the global village, and that would show that they're flourishing economically. So you could unpack the source further by adding evidence to continue the source and looking at those claims. Added to that, though, you could talk about opponents of the source. An opponent of the source might suggest that the claim that isolationism limits our potential is biased, is unjustified, and isn't and cannot be an absolute, right? That isolationism doesn't always limit our potential. And they might end up, these opponents of the source, they might say that isolationism is more than just economic, that another nuance or dimension of potential is cultural. So they might look at how culturally isolating doesn't limit our potential, it might actually insulate and protect us from forces like assimilation and homogenization and Americanization. So another layer of unpacking the source, beyond just adding evidence to continue the logic of proponents of the source, would be to take the claims of the source, the assumptions of the source, and to expose them from the lens of the perspective of opponents of the source. So opponents of the source would attack this claim from the source that isolationism always limits our potential by showing that there are times that isolationism is beneficial. During times of crisis, it might be more important to build walls than bridges. During COVID-19, nations restricted international travel. Why did we do that? We did that to protect our countries because security was more important than maintaining global connections. And through isolationism, we didn't limit our potential. We limited our potential exposure to COVID. And by limiting our potential exposure to COVID, we actually strengthened our potential of stabilizing our economy. As a kind of not a long-term, but an immediate reaction to COVID was also that nations might want to think about reshoring their supply lines. That as we are globalized, we're vulnerable during crises, we're vulnerable for any disruptions in supply chains. So if the computer chip factories in Taiwan have been shut down because of a COVID outbreak in Taiwan, and we import all of our computer chips from Taiwan, all of our computer chips come from Taiwan, but we can't get them because they're closed. Well, now our industries can be somewhat paralyzed because of that. So there was this idea of reshoring some of our essential services or essential industries, essential products like computer chips, so that if there is a global crisis that severs supply lines, supply chains, then we are less vulnerable. So in that case, isolationism doesn't limit our potential. Isolation might actually um, protect us from crisis. So one thing that you can do to get up to that PF level is to look at the source and unpack it and say proponents of the source would continue this claim by looking at this, or the source is inspired by events such as this. But then in a reverse situation, you could also look at it and say, you know, opponents of the source would reject this claim that with globalizing comes this idea of flourishing. You can look at that by looking at the cultural contamination that results from entering into the global market. That what we see is the loss of language, the loss of culture in this Americanizing and anglicizing and homogenizing world. That local businesses and local culture often is pushed to the margin by global businesses and global culture, to the point that some of the global businesses and culture ends up becoming lost. Another way to get to that PF is to further unpack the idea of potential and flourishing, and talking about it under the lens of more than just economic, but you can look at it as a political concept or as a social concept or a cultural concept, beyond just the economic concept. There's obviously military aspects of it and stuff like that you could get to. And then you might be saying, well, how do I get to an E? Well, if you do both of those things, unpack the significance of language, of terms like potential and flourishing, by looking at the dimensions that they could represent, and how what does it mean to flourish might be different from one perspective to another. From the perspective of an ultra nationalist or a social Darwinist, to flourish you must do it at the expense of your neighbors. From the perspective of an internationalist or a supranationalist, to flourish might be the idea of tolerance and plurality, right? So you can look at the complexity of language to get to an E. You could also add, though, that idea of evidence that would further the perspective and evidence that would challenge the perspective would help you get to an E. Another thing that I like here is to talk about how can we quantify the claims of the source? How can we quantify, how can we measure that isolationism limits our potential? And how can we quantify that connecting with others helps us flourish? And I think talking about that quantification of the claims of the sources is somewhat organic when you talk about the evidence that promotes or challenges the source itself. So what I have here that we're going to quickly look at is a guide of steps. The cautionary introduction here, though, is some of these steps overlap, right? It's going to be like step 4, step 5. It's like, didn't we do this in step 3? It's because in order to describe them on page, some of it begins to repeat. And there's going to be things that are listed here that aren't necessary. And again, it also says here, please keep in mind that the samples presented, they're going to be way beyond the E level. So don't get intimidated by the samples. All right, step 1, you could have a hook. Not everybody has a hook. Most people don't have a hook. But if you want to have a hook, it's like big picture theme. What is the course, or what is this source about? So this is an example of a sample. In an age where borders blur under the weight of global markets and media, the question of whether nations should safeguard their cultural identity or embrace the forces of globalization becomes inseparable from how we define flourishing itself. That's a big picture statement about what this source is about. But you don't have to have that to get to 100%. You could have something like, subject of great controversy is to what extent does globalization benefit nations? Just a quick little introduction into the overall topic. Second step, you need to work towards identifying the perspective of the source, because that is the assigned task in the analysis. Connecting it to the theme of the course in grade 10 globalization. For example, the source begins with the phrase, isolationism limits our potential. Therefore, you can identify the perspective attached to that statement and the complexity surrounding the language. Here's the sample. Here's like a PF sample, and then we have a sample that goes way beyond the E. So by suggesting that isolationism limits our potential, the phrase frames withdrawal from the world as inherently restrictive, while leaving open the question of whether that unrealized potential should be understood in economic, social, political, or cultural terms. This talks about the dimensions of globalization. So we're into that PF level, but it's not as precise as the expanded sample here. So in the expanded sample, it doesn't just list social, political, economic, and cultural, it unpacks them, right? Social potential reflects improvements in health and education and quality of opportunity. Political potential speaks to a state's resilience and influence. Cultural potential emphasizes creativity and adaptability expressed in arts, and this is much more comprehensive, much more precise, right? And again, way beyond any, even in the grade 12 level, but it kind of shows what this nuance of breaking down that first claim would look like in more depth. So step 3 is the same as step 2, but it's just like, let's continue unpacking the key language, see if there's more that we can state, but also unpack more key language. So although the source rejects isolationism, the appeal of isolationism is highly contingent on the lens through which it is viewed. So this is beginning to introduce that complexity of the source by looking at the division of society surrounding it, and the idea that there is no consensus, right? That there will be opponents to the source and the claims and the assumptions made by the source. So for example, just pulling one of them out, culturally, isolationism promises to preserve traditions, but critics note that exchange has always fueled creativity, art, and technological innovation. So this, from a cultural lens, looks at the idea of whether or not isolationism is good or bad. So that step 3 is similar to step 2, but it's adding more of that division of society nuance to it. Step 4, identify and explore the goal of the source. So again, we've already talked about how the goal is flourishing. The path to achieve that is globalization, connecting with others. The obstacle is this temptation to isolate, and the threat is, or the warning is, that if you isolate, you limit your potential. So the source holds out the promise of flourishing, yet much like the idea of potential, the term remains deliberately vague. And this blown up E-level example here shows what do you do with that vagueness, and you again unpack it with the different dimensions. It talks politically, socially, culturally, economically. Socially, it might mean healthy populations, accessible education, and strong networks of trust and cohesion. That's what socially flourishing nations look like. What does it mean to be a politically flourishing nation? So these samples are showing that PFE level by showing that these terms are more than just economic, and what you can add to it is the idea that not everybody would agree that not everybody would agree what a healthy population looks like. We're talking about physical health, mental health, and not everybody would agree that that should be a government-provided industry, universal health care. Should it be a private industry? So even in that term alone, there's complexity, right? Step 5, identify the means to achieve the goal. We've already done that, so some of these things just get checked off. We talked about how globalization, connecting with others, is the means to achieve the goal of flourishing. So here's the statement. The statement positions globalization, or it offers globalization as the necessary pathway or vehicle to flourishing by equating connection or connectivity with prosperity. It reflects a familiar pro-globalization argument, long advanced by, and then it blows it up a little bit. Like, this is the who would say this, right? Who would say this? The IMF and World Bank would say it. Who do they say it to, and why are they saying it is added here. So it's not just like, here's who might say it, pro-globalization, but under what circumstances. So this is very specifically who might say it, and this looks at why they say it. So the who and the why this is said makes this an E-level identification of the pro-globalization perspective. And again, we've already talked about how we could expand the evidence or expand the perspective by providing evidence, right? And this is the purpose of this sample paragraph. And again, keep in mind that it would all be one paragraph, and that this is in much, much, much more depth than you would need. Introduce the voice of opposition, right? We've already talked about the bias, the limitations, the assumptions. If you haven't already done that, we want to introduce the idea that not everybody agrees with the source, that there are opponents of the source. So economically, critics highlight that openness is not cost-free. Protectionist backlashes such as Trump-era tariffs revealed both the vulnerabilities of interdependence and the real price paid by consumers through higher cost and reduced output. So there's lots of ways to look at the complexity by looking at the lack of consensus surrounding ideas like globalization leads to flourishing. So in short, the source assumes a largely positive linear outcome while glossing over who benefits, who loses, and the political, social, and cultural challenges that can arise. So this is still like a PFE-ish level analysis that could replace all of that. So yes, some of the samples are quite long, right? And very, very precise. Much more than expected in a closed situation. You're writing an exam, you don't get to research things, you're not meant to be able to memorize this much stuff. But if it becomes a take-home thing, then the bar can go up quite significantly. But in class, to recognize the division of society and the significance of it, I think you've done it there in the short version. Again, summarize the division. We have a long version of it. We have a second version of it. We have a third version of it. And we've already talked about quantifying the claims. Summarize any other possible considerations. So rather than just talking about proponents and opponents, is there anything else you've studied that could fit in? So in our class, we've talked about Rousseau. In our class, we've talked about Schopenhauer. In our class, I've mentioned Mussolini. So this is where a student, if it was a take-home project, would go to their cast of characters and say, what might this individual, what might Sorel or Gentile think about this source? This is all, I would argue, especially at the grade 10 level, unexpected if it was an exam. But if it was a take-home assignment, then you could certainly take some time to make those connections. Once you're done, you'll make a thesis statement, and we'll go over that in another video. So in summary, you have to analyze the source. How do you do it? Big picture, identify the theme, globalization. You might want to identify claims, isolationism limits our potential. When we connect, we flourish. You might want to connect those to evidence that would further them or evidence that would challenge them. You might want to unpack key terms, like in this case, potential and flourish, and to see how there's different dimensions of it and how there's not a consensus surrounding whether or not one thing leads to another. And you might want to try to see if you can quantify these claims. Is there any way to actually prove the source correct or incorrect?